Hi, and welcome to the Indeed podcast. I'm your host, Isabella Preloja. Today we have the second of our two-part interview series with Brand-Jacobsen, President of the Romanian Peace Institute and Director of the Department of Peace Operations. Today's interview is on designing evidence-based initiatives in the PCVE field. Kai shares his insights on designing evidence-based initiatives, drawing on more than 25 years of experience working around the world. He emphasizes the importance of grounding initiatives in robust evidence, engaging all relevant stakeholders, and maintaining honesty and realism to achieve meaningful impact. He addresses common misconceptions about evidence-based work and highlights the necessity of testing assumptions, fostering a community of practice, and mitigating the risks of false positives and negatives. Additionally, he underscores the critical role of effective, practical training and the value of cross-disciplinary learning to enhance competencies in countering violent extremism. This interview is part of our overall work in the Indeed project, an initiative which has brought together researchers, policymakers and practitioners from across the EU to advance evidence-based evaluation, policy and practice in the PCVE and de-radicalization fields. Indeed is supported with funding from the European Commission. You can find out more about the Indeed project, including the Indeed evidence-based evaluation tool, the repositories on risk and protective factors and evidence-based initiatives, the Indeed e-guidebooks, training resources and online courses by visiting the Indeed website at indeedproject.eu. But for now, here's designing evidence-based initiatives in the PCVE field with Brand-Jacobsen. Welcome to the Indeed Knowledge Series interviews on evidence-based evaluation. We have today Brand-Jacobsen, the President of the Romanian Peace Institute and the Director of the Department of Peace Operations and a senior expert in evidence-based evaluation. Welcome, Kai.
Thank you so much, Isabella.
It's so great to have another conversation with you. We just had a great conversation on the basis and some issues regarding evidence-based evaluation, and we're back discussing about designing evidence-based initiatives. So my first question will be, what does it mean to design evidence-based initiatives? Aren't all initiatives evidence-based?
Would that they were. So you would think that, but actually this is one of the things that I really appreciate in the Indeed project, because we are looking at evidence-based evaluation, but we're looking at evidence-based evaluation for the purpose of supporting evidence-based practice and evidence-based policy. So when we're speaking about designing, planning, developing, and implementing initiatives that are evidence-based, we're speaking about initiatives where, when we design it, we are looking at what is the best available evidence that we have in our own experience in our organizations and agencies, in our sector, in the field, evidence gathered from evaluation, so both internally and externally, on understanding how to do things, what works, what doesn't work, what should be done, and learning the lessons. And together with best available evidence, we're looking at professional judgment and expertise. So where we design initiatives which really harvest and engage with the learning, the understanding, the experience of professionals and practitioners in the field. And the third pillar, community context, community perceptions, needs, values, experience, that when we are designing initiatives, they are designed robustly understanding the context and understanding the communities and the stakeholders that we're engaging with. That community can be a school, that community can be a community in a society of peoples of diverse backgrounds. It can be, depends on what the initiative is towards. Now, in reality, what we know is that a lot of initiatives, one, there's a difference in how they're designed depending upon whether they're coming from state institutions, public institutions, or, for example, the civil society sector. So in state institutions, you'll often have strategies and policies set by national or state or local governments, different levels. And then actors such as social workers, educators, law enforcement have to implement those. In the civil society and NGO sector, you'll often have non-governmental organizations or community service organizations which have to apply for funding to a donor. The donor can be local or national authorities, foundations, in our context in the European Union, often the European Commission. In both cases, the strategies and policies which guide the work of public institutions and an overwhelming majority of programming developed by non-state actors and civil society actors are often developed not drawing upon evidence, often developed in a rush to respond either to a directive from a state agency or a call for grants, and are overwhelmingly designed with limited or no engagement with actual stakeholders and communities. And these three factors are also reasons why so much of it doesn't work.
Well, you actually almost answered my next question, because it was related to the actual outcomes of the initiatives that usually fall through the cracks, and they don't reach, again, the results they were intending to reach. And I was wondering, I mean, you already mentioned some, but what are some of the elements that lead to this?
Well, one thing right in your question is the aspect of results they're intended to reach. So right there, we need to begin becoming both much more honest, much more realistic, and also much more professional when we look at the results that we're trying to achieve. For example, if we're speaking about civil society organizations doing work with youth, doing awareness raising programs, doing programs in schools, when you do the activity, a workshop, a training, or let's say you're doing a movie showing because you want to impact people with the ideas of what's covered in the movie. The activity, the event, when you bring people together, when you do the workshop, you do the training, you show the film, can be exciting, can be inspiring. And if you're the ones doing it, you're putting in so much effort to make it happen. You're engaging in the moment. It can seem like it's been a huge success and it's been very important. It doesn't mean that it has in any way impacted the people who took part. And it may have impacted them, but does it lead to changes in attitudes and values and perceptions and behavior? It's not just about, was it exciting, was it fun, was it intense, was I impacted in the moment, but will it lead to change going further? And there are some in the field who will say, well, I can't control that, or how can we do that? Reality is we can. We can design our initiatives and know how to do them and what to do in ways that actually do contribute to meaningful results and more significant and sustained impact. But that comes down to really understanding the field. And what evidence-based practice is about is working as a field to learn and to harvest the lessons and the understanding with the same rigor that a doctor would, to understand what works and what doesn't. And in medicine, the steadiness of a surgeon's hand when they're doing an operation can affect whether that patient survives or doesn't. In our work, how police implement an operation, how governments implement activities, how practitioners and organizations in the field do our work affects whether it works or doesn't, and whether it contributes to those impacts. So what are some of the effects of initiatives that are not evidence-based? And that are not really engaging with the depth that is needed to ensure that people have the training they have, that we implement activities in the right way, that we're implementing the right activities for the right context. What happens is sometimes nothing, neither positive nor negative. We're doing the work, but it doesn't actually contribute to meaningful changes. We just do lots of activities, and that's a big part of the field. Sometimes great things. The project is great, the initiative is great, but it's short term. Because we're designing our work and we have these structural factors where they're often dependent on donors, short term. You can have some of the best practices in the field and it ends after 2 years, or it ends after 3 years because there isn't further funding. And sometimes, very often, negative. Our initiatives fuel resentment, alienate communities, enable privilege. So we reach the children and young people easy to reach in some schools, but you reinforce exclusion of others. All of these are elements of the failure to develop a field of actual evidence-based practice.
But this is really interesting, actually. It leads me to two questions, but my first one would be, because I found really interesting your comparison with the medical field. And I was thinking the same, that when a doctor is looking at their patient, they're looking first, I suppose, at the analysis before, right? Why this person fainted, or etc. And this leads me to the progress of looking at designing an evaluation. I suppose one of it should be our assumptions should be tested, right? And our own perspectives of what would be impactful in a community or what wouldn't be. But we've seen so many assumptions about so many issues that we have in societies. And I suppose that someone that's trying to change, because you were talking of change, something in our society, they should first, I suppose, look at assumptions. Like, what are your assumptions about the issues that you're trying to address? And I was wondering if you can tell us what are some ways in which we can enable our community of practice to address this risk of assumptions and look at how we choose stakeholders and how we choose our methodologies.
So there's so many important aspects in that question. And let's start with that parallel drawn with medicine. First thing I should also say is we know there's so many challenges in medicine. You know, a lot of it is profit-driven. In medicine, like in evaluation, you often have the arrogance of the practitioner. You do have too much medicine that is done truly without listening to the patients and without understanding the context, and many things like that. But good medicine, good practice medicine, one component of it is diagnosis. Deeply understanding the situation, and medicine has developed methods for doing that diagnosis. Now, those methods can hold bias and prejudice, whether you value certain types of medicine or others, or whether you're only exposed to one discipline or area of practice. So there's implicit biases, prejudices, which affect the practice of diagnosis also in medicine. In our field, in PCVE, one good practice, one foundation for our work should be rigorous, robust, tested, multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral understanding of the situation. That does not exist in most practice today. What we do have is that if someone is trained from a law enforcement perspective, they'll often have a specific set of diagnostic tools and lenses they look at things. If I'm trained as a social worker, if I'm trained coming at it from education, if I come at it from a gender lens, if I come at it as a youth worker, we all have our different, both what enables us to see, but also things we don't see because of our training, because of the lenses we bring. And so very often we may only see part of the picture, we may leave out key dimensions, and we may bring the assumptions of our training and the assumptions of our field about what the problem is, about how things will develop, about who are the stakeholders we should work with, many other aspects. And all of those can affect whether we make the right diagnosis. Do we understand what the situation is? Do we understand what really needs to be addressed or what needs to be changed? Then it also affects the tools that we come with and what we think the answers are. And again, because we're all trained in our different disciplines, we're so often not even aware that the lens I'm bringing and the tools I have actually may make the situation worse or not be the right ones that help best. In terms of how do we identify assumptions, so one of the tools that has been developed over, it actually began to emerge in international development practice already in the 1950s. It became more explicit in the 80s and 90s, and then got its current name in the 90s, this idea of theories of change, or what you might call the logic of our programs. What is the actual thinking behind them? The reason why those who developed it as such call it theory of change is they're really trying to bring to the forward your idea of why something is the way it is or how something will happen. Until you test it, until you prove it, that's your theory. That's what you think will happen. You may have good reason for it, you may have decades of expertise, you may have all of these studies, but what you're putting forward in your explanation, that is a theory of how you think things will unfold. You could also call it, your program logic or your causal chain, why you think things will happen the way they might happen. What is important is that most of the time in the field, we just do things. We have our project, we have our strategy, we have what we're doing, but we don't make explicit the thinking it's based upon. So for example, we don't make explicit our analysis of the problem and why we think that those are the factors. We rarely make explicit test or question our goals and objectives. Are they the right ones? Are those what we should be aiming for? And then there are so many dimensions of when we're looking at what we actually do, the interventions, from police operations to intelligence services to educational programs, where we assume aspects of that what we do are the right things, that we reach the right people and have the right stakeholders. We assume what they'll do with it. So this is called assumptions mapping, and there are many different tools that can be used for it. But people are broadly not trained in it. Within the field, every time we introduce it, what we hear is both how incredibly important this is, how simple it is to learn to do it right, how powerful it is, and how they've never done it before.
Right.
And this for me is at the level of a kindergarten level of the work, what there should be. We need to take steps to have people trained in actual practical methodologies that help us know how to design initiatives effectively. There's been some steps in that work in different areas over the last decades, not only in the PCVE de-radicalization field, but huge amounts of work in social work field, educational engagements, and especially within peace building and international development cooperation. And we could definitely do with a little bit more learning from others, learning from other sectors, so that we don't need to re-experience discoveries that have already been done.
Right.
And instead we can, with curiosity, with open mind, look at what can be learned from others. Sometimes it can't just be copy-paste. We need to translate, interpret, see how it makes sense for our field, but there's a lot we could do to move towards much better practice than what is being done today.
But this is really interesting because actually very recently I was reading a project, and it was an evaluation, it was a designing initiative project. They were trying to build kind of a project in which they would find out in some region in, I think it was the African continent, where they would try to see why people don't vote. So then they tried to do it very simply with the survey. So they just disseminated the survey, and they were getting in results saying that a large portion of the population wasn't voting, and it's because they're in villages and they're not interested. But actually what was the problem was that a lot of them didn't have access to transport to go to the voting stations, or that there was gender-based violence happening in their homes, so they weren't allowed. Women weren't allowed, some children weren't allowed, or actually young people that had the power to vote weren't allowed to go to the voting stations. So then how do we deal with, when utilizing primary evidence, how do we deal with mitigating the risks of false positive and false negatives? And is this an issue of building more awareness when we're designing initiatives? Or is this an issue of cultural competency and building it in our designing initiatives?
So first, to go with the analysis that you mentioned, that you started with. One aspect is engage with best available evidence. One challenge we often see is when the expert, the evaluator, or the people designing the program do it without that first step of looking what else is being done and what has been done before. And those are rarely done to any significant extent. I may be aware of what someone told me at a RAN event or what I came across in a workshop, but there's not competent, professional, deep engagement with what's been done before. Often. Some do. A very, very small minority of the field. So normally we're in our area of practice, we have the people we know around us, what we happen to be ad hoc exposed to. There's no systematic, there's no thorough, there's no rigorous effort. When you're doing the situation analysis, part of that is rigorous engagement with mapping and understanding what are others doing now and what has been done before. Because something like looking at the issue of participation in elections is not new. It has been done many times before. there's a lot of evidence that can be drawn upon and understanding from that, including flaws in past approaches and designs. That doesn't mean it's not important to do it now, because maybe there's a new situation, we're looking at the current context, but it means when we do it now, try to be informed, try to learn from what has been happened before. Right. Second part of what you said is professional ignorance and arrogance or assumption. When someone brings in prejudices, often from privilege that we're unaware of, and our particular ideologies or unquestioned dogmas and assumptions, and we think, oh, people don't vote, youth don't take part, these people don't do that because they're lazy, they're uninterested. And implicit in that often, I don't know, I can't speak to this situation, I'm ignorant on this situation, but if I'm trying to extrapolate from it, what I've seen in cases that I do know is that the person comes with their lens, which they may not even be aware of, and they take a situation and they impose their understanding on it. You find the answer that you're looking for, or the one that reinforces the prejudice you already have that you may not even be aware of. Whereas what you said relates more to what should be an evidence-based approach, where before making your assumptions of what the cause is or how you'll prejudicially interpret the data, you make sure that you're getting information in the right ways. And you make sure also, for example, looking with different practitioners who might have insight. So if you're speaking about a particular demographic, why rural women aren't voting, there are amazing organizations of rural women, by rural women, or working with rural women who may have longer term access and entry. Say, for example, the evaluation or the analysis is being conducted by a university from that country, a private firm or consultancy company from that country, a evaluation agency from that country, or a university consultancy or evaluation from abroad. And this is important. You can be from a country and be as prejudiced and biased by privilege, by rank, by title, by living in the capital, by arrogance and prejudice towards people in rural communities as coming from abroad. Sometimes more so, but also those coming from abroad can have that as well. Now, let's say that the one doing the analysis or evaluation comes from outside the rural village context. They may not have background and in terms of life experience of being a rural villager. They may, if you're speaking about women in rural context, maybe the expert or the evaluator or the academic is a man or is a woman of privilege who may not know the realities and life experiences of women in those contexts. And for all these factors, they may give an interpretation of data which presents one causal chain, people don't take part because they're not interested, and be very unaware of other factors. It happens that a huge amount of academic literature and publications and a huge amount of evaluation findings are untested and unverified because they're false. And this gets us back to needing to think through how we do analysis, how we do baselining, how we do evaluation, and together with how we do it, who does it and who's involved, and how do we test and verify, so that when conclusions, findings, recommendations are brought forward, we do that check to see, are they actually correct? Because if we then base initiatives and design initiatives to try and increase voter turnout, and we think that it's because people aren't interested, and so that's our diagnosis, and we try and design initiatives to get them interested, but we don't address power and abuse, safety of someone voting, and the fact that there may be domestic violence or threats or intimidation, and it's not always domestic violence, it can also be issues of safety and intimidation from different political parties or against people because of their regional community, their ethnic identity, their religion, their language. Anyone who's a real expert in elections and voter participation that has come at it from understanding these different perspectives will spot things like that. But many aren't. And that's why you can't depend ad hoc upon the expert knowing enough. You need to develop methodologies and approaches where you're actually engaging, listening to communities, listening to the real practitioners and professionals, people for whom it is their ground, their context, their area, with respect.
Absolutely. Actually, this leads me to ask you, because we've been talking about so many factors that lead to an ethical, a legal, and a socially and culturally competent evaluation design. So then, what is the theory of change that you were referring to, and can you break it down for us, and why is it important?
So theory of change, as I was saying, is the explanation or the narrative of how we think things happen, how we think they change, of a program, project, or an intervention, of what in the Indeed project we're calling initiatives. Also, there's theories of change behind strategies, behind policies. And a theory of change engages with some key building blocks. One is first your identification and analysis of the problem, why you think that's a problem, those factors, and that itself is a theory. That's something where there are assumptions. You need to make that explicit and test it. The overall objectives and goals, your desired future, not just at a program or an initiative level, but the broader impact that those should be contributing to. Your project level goals and objectives, what you want to achieve with your project, your program, your strategy, your policy, the specific objectives you're trying to achieve. Then your approach. Why do you think that approach will contribute to achieving those objectives? Then how you do it, how implementing your activities, your initiative, every step along the way, how you put into practice in the real context, who you engage with, who does it, how they do it, will enable you to realize the approach you're doing, will enable you to realize your specific objectives. So these are at least 5 components. You need to make that explicit, you need to write it out, you need to test it. Not that hard when people are trained, but you need to make sure it's honest, it's rigorous. And then you do what we were speaking about before, the assumptions mapping. You look at what are the implicit or explicit assumptions of why we think that this is true. And here, one of the tools that is so easy and so powerful to use is what we call the 5 or the 7 levels of why. So if you say, why do you think that's the problem? And then someone answers, then you say why to that, and you keep following through, and then you test, is it true?
Right.
Now, what's so important, in recent years, basically over the last 15, 20 years, more organizations and agencies are engaging with the concept of theories of change, not because they've been trained in it, not because they understand it, not because they find it useful, but because donors are requesting it in proposals. And then what happens is there'll be some very scanty, basically writing out of this is the theory of change. It's rushed, you're doing it for the grant. Right. And then it asks, and what are the assumptions? And they'll list the assumptions, and then that's it. But that's like my driving towards a cliff, noting that there's a cliff, but I keep on driving. Assumptions, the assumptions that are in our projects, that our logic is built upon, which may not be true, can critically affect whether the work succeeds or not. I assume that I'll have the right people in the room. What if you don't? Have you really done a proper stakeholder mapping? Have you selected and done that thorough engagement to make sure that the people that are in the room are the ones that should be there, are the ones that can use it? I might assume that the method I'm using or the training I'm giving is the right one. What if it's a horrible training? What if it's a bad trainer? In the PCVE field, I'm stunned to see how many people think lecturing is training. A lot of what's done in the field is by bringing in different so-called experts who stand and deliver and lecture at people and with PowerPoint. And that is not training. Training is where you develop operational capability. It's where you have performance competency. The person learns what they need to be able to do what they need to do in the context in which they have to do it with what they have available. Training needs to equal performance, competence, and capability. If it is not doing that, it is a talk, it is a lecture, it's not a training. So I assume that the method I'm using will achieve the results I want. I stand and give a lecture that will achieve competency. And the reality is it doesn't.
Yeah.
Now, in assumptions mapping, I can see that that's an assumption. But the point isn't to identify the assumption and stop there. The point is then to ask yourself, what do you need to do to prove or to test if it's true or not? And or what do you need to change or to improve in your initiative or in your logic to replace that if it's wrong? Or what steps would I have to do to make sure I'm getting the right participants? What steps would I have to do to make sure that my training methodology is appropriate? First is overcome arrogance. So for someone who thinks they're an expert, or for someone who's done it many times, they may simply, be convinced that they'll manage to do it, or that their method is the right one. And the need to overcome arrogance isn't only within our field. I mean, we went for centuries believing that the earth was flat and that the universe revolves around the earth. Right. And people who questioned or brought different views were often, strong reaction. Yeah. So more integrity, more competence, more humility, people learning actual skills, not just the dogma or doctrine of how I've always done it before, but theory of change is about making explicit our logic and understanding in order to open it to testing so that we can make it better and make the planning and design of our initiatives better, drawing upon evidence, because we're not the first ones to do it. There's a huge amount of practice out there, drawing upon professional judgment, experience, and expertise, and drawing upon deep knowledge and understanding of the context, the stakeholders, the communities, and also engaging with those two communities and professionals to test the initiatives to see if they really are the right ones, addressing the right issues in the right way to achieve the right goals, and in such a way that it's likely that they might actually achieve it.
This is very interesting. Actually, I was thinking what you were saying about training. I think training is not talked about nearly as much as it should be. And what you were saying about the dynamic between the trainer and the trainee, it reminded me of Paulo Freire, of his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he's talking about being thought at instead of being thought with, like the co-ownership of learning. I think it's so important in this area.
Absolutely, and there is a huge need. The field is growing, and we are trying to grow the evidence and the understanding of what works and doesn't, and you meet the most amazing practitioners and people that are doing this work every single day, from law enforcement, from civil society, from community-based organizations, from teachers. And there's a lot of great experience and great knowledge on the ground. But like we know from any field, training matters, education and training. And there was a brilliant project supported by the European Commission a few years ago called Peace Training. And it was looking at the training and preparation for deployment of people working in peace building and crisis management missions. And it looked at everything done by universities, not degree programs, but professional certificate training, by state institutions and agencies, staff colleges, diplomatic academies, by the OSCE, the United Nations, by private training institutes, non-governmental organizations, private sector, all of them. Any training that happened with the intent of preparing professionals, preparing adults for being able to deploy to do a certain job. The project didn't only look at training, capacity building, and preparation within the peace building and prevention fields. It also looked at others. It looked at what is done in the medical professions, especially in the nursing field, where there's so much interesting work looking at how to build competency and what are the competencies that are needed. It looked in the business sector, it looked in the military, it looked in sports sciences.
Very diverse.
Diverse areas where in each of these fields they're trying to understand the issue of how to improve performance competency, operational competency. And there's a brilliant quote that I love from the sports sciences, which one of our colleagues, a researcher, brought forward in it, where he said, he was quoting from a publication in the field, "You don't learn to play football by PowerPoint and lecture." So when you try to improve capability, performance competency in the football field, one, you do training, your diet matters, your health, you do practice. So experiential, skills-based application, you play on the football field. In your training for the moment where you get on the field, they've developed all different things that help you to learn how to shoot, how to dribble, how to pass. They break down every action that is done, and they have specific techniques and methodologies to train you for it. And they have specific ways of testing whether you're doing it or improving it And then there's the coaching and all these other, and that's all preparation for the field. Then you gain practice time by doing it, all rehearsal for the moment you're actually out there at game night and doing the game. Yes. You break down at a micro level the capabilities needed, the technique, the skill, and deeply understanding also the importance of psychology.
Right.
Because it's not about whether I've sat in a room and heard someone talk at me that I'm then able to do something. Do I have the confidence? Have I practiced it? Have I received coaching and support?
Do I feel empowered?
Do I feel empowered? Am I empowered? Because what if you have the best training in the world, but someone goes back to the agency and the agency, the boss doesn't support it? Or they've been trained, but it's not within their roles and responsibilities, not what they're supposed to be doing.
Happens.
So anyone who were to take seriously the field of building capabilities and competencies, you look at all of these aspects. In reality today, much of what we call training in the field is itself not good training. So it is lecture-based. It's often delivered by people who don't have the professional knowledge and understanding to actually be the right people in the room delivering it. It's often delivered with content and methodology of approach that could be improved. It's not always reaching the right people, and there's all of these aspects around it. So there's a huge amount of activity that's done in the field of training, and we see less than significant results in the field of actually developing competency. There's also, I think it was in 2017, a paper from the Commission on adult education and vocational training. And one of the lines, I think it was even right on the first page, that it says is, training does not build competency. And that's true. As someone who's delivered more than 400 trainings, I am passionate about training. Training can be amazing when you bring everything you have to it and when you do it right, when you also really make the steps and effort to understand the participants, when you understand the context, when you work with a professional commitment to bring the best of training methodologies, content, and approaches. Training can be powerful. But like the quote from the sports sciences suggests, or if you look at learning in business or in medicine, you have the educational foundation. I don't want to go to a surgeon who did a weekend training or even a 5-day training and put my life or the life of loved ones. I want professional knowledge and development. The surgeon also goes through practice, a practicant. They need to work to gain experience with other experts to gain that. They're in a field where there's conferences, publications they're expected to read, further knowledge development opportunities, where they are tested and held accountable for what they're doing, and all these things together are aimed towards improving performance capability. Now, we've gone a long way from just discussing about evidence-based initiatives, but in fact we're applying it. This is looking at the designing of evidence-based approaches to building competency and recognizing that there's a lot more out there and there's innovations and better practice which we could be using, and we need to test and to gather the evidence of what works, what doesn't work, and be willing to redesign and to change our methods and approaches when we see that they are either not the right ones or they're certainly not the ones that responsibly or correctly contribute to really helping people to gain the skills, the knowledge, have the attitudes, have the competence they need for what they're doing.
Kai, I can see that you're extremely passionate about what you're doing in this field. So what's your favorite part of designing an evidence-based initiative?
I love all of it. I do this because I love it. I love, I think I would say my favorite part is realizing what it's for. That whatever area we're talking about in preventing and countering violent extremism or de-radicalization, or if I'm working in peace building in a context affected by war, realizing that what we're doing is about people's lives, and that what we're doing, if we do it well,
can have a huge impact.
Can have a huge impact on people's lives and on our world. What I enjoy most is engaging with people and doing it. I love the process of learning about the field. And I often use examples of great football players or great musicians, great scientists, great doctors, great teachers, anyone who you'd look at and you can appreciate their dedication, their skill, their performance. And if you think about the arts, if you think about, musicians, or in sports, or in reality, actually, in any area, when you see something being done at a level of excellence, it can sometimes be so magnificent, so beautiful, that it's as if it's grace. I mean, I remember listening to Yo-Yo Ma at a performance, or if you watch a great ballet, or a great ski jumper, or a great football player, or anything, or if you see a parent handling a conversation with their child with wisdom, empathy, patience, and grace, and that moment looks like grace. But behind that performance are 10,000 hours of sweat. Behind that performance is what loving what you do really means. The truthful, authentic dedication and the humility of practice, that you do it, you practice it, you practice it, you practice it, and you practice it again. And you learn about what others are doing, not because it's a burden, not because a donor told you to, but because you are competent, because you're a professional, because you realize that what you're doing is for something and that it affects people's lives. So I love learning that. I love listening to and engaging with people with whom we're doing our work and initiatives, because that's what it's all about. We're trying to do this to have a difference and a change in people's lives. And I love, and I've been extraordinarily fortunate to have the opportunity to engage with so many dedicated practitioners and people working in the field from all over the world. And that goes from the program that I was just in last week in Madrid with Indeed, the training we were doing there. I mean, here we had people working in evaluation, people working in youth engagements, in working with victims and survivors of terrorism, police and civil guard, and people with so many different backgrounds. But if people around the world could just have the chance to meet these daily practitioners and to see the integrity, the dedication, their own humanity that they bring to it, it is awing and inspiring and humbling and a joy. I've also had the chance to work with the youngest practitioner I ever met in the world. She was 82 when we met, Erwin Harbottle. And the legacy and life that Erwin contributed and the work that she did was stunning. But when we first met, when she was 82, she had so much joy, so much curiosity and willingness to learn. We met because she was 82 and coming to a training program because she still wanted to learn. And that's why I always refer to Erwin as the youngest person that I've ever known in the field.
All right.
But I've also worked in brilliant work with Save the Children International, where we were working with children and young people affected by war and armed conflict around the world, with youth that were 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. And to see the brilliance and passion that they brought to wanting to make a difference in wars affecting their countries. So when you ask me what is my favorite part of designing evidence-based initiatives, all of them.
Thank you, Kai, for this beautiful outlook you've given us on the holistic nature of what designing an evidence-based initiative is. It's not a checklist of technical things, but it's actually looking at the world, in its entirety. It's beautiful. Thank you very much. Thank you for this interview, and I'm looking forward to your actions in the future. I'm looking forward to seeing what you write, the books, and your future programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much.